My friend Sarah, who I met while I was at Kenyon College, was the first person I knew who had really beautiful tattoos. They were on her arms and her back, and they almost all had stories behind them. We should have, there we go, here are a couple of them. They represent, one of them represents when she broke her back in a car accident that fully healed. The ship is actually from the Narnia books, the first chapter book she remembered reading with her father. They tell you important parts of her life in a very particular, very permanent way. She was raised in the church, and her father was a pastor. And she actually was one of the first people I felt safe talking to about my own call to ministry while I was still in college. She'd never had any trouble telling her stories, which I admired, her stories about her faith and also how she got these amazing marks on her body. And during Lent, we're going to be talking about a very different kind of way to mark our lives. We're going to talk about 5 different marks of discipleship, some of the signs that somebody's a committed and dedicated follower of Jesus. Last week, Dave talked about worship, about how worship is often our first encounter with Jesus and with a church community. He spoke about how worship is a give and a take, that we bring things to worship, but we also receive from God in worship. But I also believe that worship leaves its mark on us, and that regular worship changes us. The second mark we're going to talk about this week is sharing. And I'm going to invite Zach Bosker, who's going to do our scripture reading this morning. I think that sharing sounds kind of simplistic at first, but in our passage today, come on down. Jesus explains why this kind of sharing is so important and urgent. It's going to be from Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 through 38.
Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field."
Thank you, Zach. Excellent. So I would assume by now, Jesus has to at least be a little bit exhausted. Did you read that first sentence? He's preached, he's evangelized, he's healed every disease and sickness, and there were always more people. I would think even for the Son of God, at some point it would have to be overwhelming. I mean, he did at times go away to be by himself just to pray. But he still looked on them with compassion, which in the Greek doesn't just mean sympathy, but a feeling deep down in your bowels, in your gut. Some kind of feeling that you just can't ignore. He knew that they were harassed and helpless. He knew how much they needed God's grace and love and healing. But it was more than that. He also describes them as the harvest. And this seems strange to me at first, that these are right next to each other, to first call them the harassed and helpless, but then to see them also as harvest. Now, I have whatever the opposite of a green thumb is. That's what I've got, unlike Joe Metzger, who was showing me pictures of his beautiful garden this week. But I do like to eat. And harvest time is the best time of the year. It's when everything is ripe and in perfect condition. The harvest is what farmers spend all season working towards, showing off beautiful tomatoes that came from tiny seeds, gorgeous tulips that previously were only bulbs. Jesus saw in this crowd God's harvest. Jesus saw in all those crowds amazing potential. He saw kingdom builders. He saw people who could also shine the light of God's glory to the world, but who had been beaten down by life, and probably in his day, maybe the Roman army. So how do you turn a crowd that is helpless and haggard into a beautiful, fulfilled harvest? It's what we proclaim here in worship week in and week out. It's by the power of Christ. And we know this because of the stories we read in the New Testament, stories of healings, stories of people being raised from the dead, even hearts being transformed like Zacchaeus and the centurion. And we also know about this power because we've experienced it personally in a wide variety of ways. One of the first things we have to do at seminary in orientation is to tell our call story. Yes, do you remember this? Okay. Why we thought we were cut out for ministry, how do we feel that God had called us to this point in our lives? And these stories were wildly different. Some people had had powerful experiences at camp. Some were preachers' kids. That sometimes happens to preachers' kids. Some were right out of college. Others were on second or third careers. And one woman in my class had grown up on a working farm in Kentucky, tried professional stand-up comedy, worked for TBN before joining the Navy to become a chaplain. Nobody wanted to follow her story. But all these stories had something in common. They had Jesus at the heart of them and a church family standing nearby. Each person knew they had not come to this point alone, but with an entire community of believers and a common story of God's grace and mercy and power. Now, these stories are not unique to pastors. Pastors just get to hear a lot of these stories. We get to witness a lot of these stories firsthand. But everyone who is trying their best, whatever that looks like, to follow Jesus has a call story. This is something we share. This belief that God has called us to be something. That we share this belief in the power of Jesus in our own lives. We believe in the power to heal painful wounds that have lived inside of us for years and years. The power to bring people together for common causes, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to visit the sick and the lonely. Ask anybody who's overcome an addiction. They know that it was not by their own power, but by something much greater. We know stories of anybody who says it could only be by God's power that people still have hope after tragic encounters. I believe that it's by Jesus' power that compels 30 or more of our youth every year to give up a week of vacation to spend it doing mission work. These stories are in us. And we know the crowds that Jesus look upon are harvest because we ourselves have been haggard and helpless, and Jesus saw our potential too. Because when we were in that place, someone from the church visited us, brought us casseroles, sent us cards. They gave us money for an unexpected bill or helped us get our car fixed. They sat next to us in worship, and they came by the funeral home. The church family showed up and brought with them the compassion of Jesus Christ. The church shared our burden. They clapped with us in celebration. They worked right beside us, and when they showed up, they reminded us that Jesus was present with us too. I think Jesus uses the term laborers or workers very intentionally. I think he's proving that he understands and accepts that getting people just to show up is hard. That following Jesus, that telling Jesus' story, that living out that story in our lives requires sacrifice and fundamental changes in how we live in the world. And Jesus wants us to tell people about it. Unfortunately, we do not get to just bask in the good news of Jesus for ourselves. It's like, oh, this feels good. Grace, mercy, this feels awesome. No, we have to start telling other people about it. And that can be hard. I heard a story this week, which I've actually heard before. A few weeks ago, some visitors came to church to see us in worship, and they came out saying, I had no idea I knew so many people from this church. Which begs the question, why don't people know you go to church here? Are you embarrassed of us? I mean, we laugh, but seriously, how has that never come up in conversation? Now, this week, Carol Dawson showed me just how easy it can be. She posted our challenge question from the end of worship last week on her Facebook page and got over 24 responses. 24 people talking about why worship was important to them. And if the people around us don't know that church is a part of our lives, if they don't know that the stories of praying and being prayed for, or of the visits to the hospital or meals after funerals, if you never describe the joy of a baby dedication or a baptism, how would they know that it's important to us? How would they know about the power of Jesus and the meaning of this church community if we don't talk about it? Immediately after this passage, Jesus sent the disciples out to cure diseases and overpower unclean spirits, but they accomplished everything because he gave them the power. It wasn't on their own. Because I worry when we don't talk about how Jesus and how this church forms us, how it takes care of us, how it celebrates with us, shapes our financial choices and our family life, that on some level we're saying that we got here and got this way all on our own. And we know that's not true. And I think people are hungry for stories of a church that works. I think it's revealed in the popularity of Pope Francis right now, how hungry people are for Christianity working, for stories of good news. And I know for a fact that these stories exist. These stories of powerful encounters with the divine and with each other. They have to, or we wouldn't keep coming back. So what are the ways people would know that Jesus and his church have changed your life? Well, the first one is just to start connecting the stories of your church life with the stories of the rest of your life. Talk about where you went to eat before your Ash Wednesday service, or who you're taking to the Easter egg hunt, about what the candlelight Christmas Eve service means to you, or when you prayed with an elder, either you or a loved one was in the hospital, or who it was who visited you at the funeral home. Tell people about how much fun you had the spring bazaar, who makes the best green beans at our potlucks. Tell them how you just really didn't like something I said in the sermon, or even last week at the communion table. It doesn't need to be a separate, special conversation. It should just be a natural part of your regular life. It can happen around any table you eat at, or counter, or tray table. It can happen in the office or over coffee at a sporting event, as I stare at the youth. And it might feel weird at first. Just be okay with that. Being uncomfortable is, in fact, not the worst thing in the world, especially if it's on behalf of the gospel. And this sharing is meant for everybody. Nobody gets a pass, because everybody here, everybody has a story. Jesus started with 12, and then he sent 70, and it only grew from there. And the harvest only gets brought in if a lot of people show up. Some of our biggest projects happen here because a large part of the church participates. VBS, Clothe a Child, just worship every week, the number of people it takes to make all this happen. And many of these programs happen and grow because we've told other people how great they are and how much we get out of them. When we share the work of the church, amazing things happen. Lives get changed. People have new visions and dream big dreams, not just for us, but for the world. Those who have been haggard and helpless start to see in themselves just a little bit of harvest. And we start to see them that way too. They're no longer strangers in a crowd, they're family. They're us. And these stories and acts of sharing mark us. They're one of the ways that we show that Jesus has laid a claim on our lives. A friend of mine works up in Illinois for hospice. And I was telling her about the sermon about the tattoos, and she said she's gotten to hear some of the stories behind some servicemen's tattoos when she sits with them. And she said the tattoos may have really faded or stretched out over time, but the story and the ink remain. Those marks are with them literally to the end. They are permanent. Most of my friends' tattoos were out where people could see them and ask her about them. People like me who might never have talked to her because in many superficial ways we were very different. But in some other ways, we were absolutely marked by the same things. These marks of discipleships we're talking about should be permanent, but also a natural part of who we are. Our stories of faith should help people understand why we're here and we're functioning and celebrating and serving and sharing because of Jesus' power, not our own. They should know how First Christian Church matters to you and to this community. We have wonderful gifts and resources and time and stories to be shared. The harvest is waiting. It's waiting for us.